Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our regularly scheduled 10 a.m. Live stream. I hope you all were able to join us yesterday for the Russia disruption and Jameson Firestone and his amazing stories of all the things happening in Russia today and over the past 15 years, of course, around the Magnitsky Act and his former legal colleague, Sergei Magnitsky. Absolutely fascinating stuff. If you missed it, as always, it's available on our YouTube channel. Subscribe and you'll never miss another talk. Speaking of other talks, let's take a quick peek at some of our upcoming talks. Next week, of course, we're going to get into Israel and Iran and look at both of their foreign policies towards one another. We'll also have a little bit of an update on what's going on the Gaza Strip. This is with author and strategic consultant Ronan Dangur. Then on the June the 3rd, which will be our last live stream for at least a few weeks as we take a bit of a hiatus in the summer months, we're looking at this fascinating talk called Stopping the Next One, Wildlife in the Next Pandemic. And in that, we'll feature two journalists who will travel 6 continents to show us all about 6 different animals that carry diseases that could cause the next pandemic. From MERS carrying camels in Africa to the pigs with influenza in Europe, we'll meet the animals and the diseases with the biggest pandemic potential and learn what we can do to stop them before it's too late. Then we go back to the Russia disruption on June 16th, where we'll feature Russian opposition leader Vladimir Kara-Murza. And then I'm highlighting here our Summer Institute, June 21st to 25th for high school and college students, which is a great way for them to learn an introduction to different languages, some of the geopolitical and cultural considerations for those languages, and then we'll have specific skills building workshops for them to just become the best students and of course, future leaders that they can be. So that is all from me for now. And let me introduce now today's 2 speakers. First up, we have Gary Sick. Good morning, Gary. It's nice to see you.
Morning. Thank you very much, Sandy. It's a pleasure.
Gary is a senior research scholar at Columbia University's Middle East Institute and an adjunct professor at the School of International and Public Affairs. He served on the National Security Council under Presidents Ford, Carter, and Reagan, and was the principal White House aide for Iran during the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis. He's a retired captain from the U.S. Navy with service in the Persian Gulf, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. Moderating today's conversation is Jim Falk. Good morning, Jim.
Hello there.
Jim is a brand new CIR board member, and we're thrilled to have him with us. He, of course, is the recently retired CEO of the Dallas World Affairs Council. I didn't get that name exactly right, but you'll fix it. And he moderates all kinds of big name foreign policy folks on his regular television show, McCuistion TV. So welcome, Jim. Welcome, Gary. Folks out there, type your questions as always into the Q&A bar, and we'll get to them when the time comes. And Jim, let me turn everything over to you.
Great, thank you, and it's good to be here. At last, I am in Santa Fe, and it's a joy to have the chance to speak with Gary, who I met a number of years ago. And I think on today's program, Gary is going to give an overview of current events of what's happening in Iran, and particularly some of the issues pertaining to the negotiations on the JCPOA. And then we'll open it up for questions, and I have a few as well. But before I turn it over completely to you, Gary, with your presentation, because we have a number of students in our audience, tell us about how you developed your interest specifically in Iran and the Middle East.
Well, it actually is a very long subject, and
keep it brief.
Yeah, I will keep it very brief. But basically, I was a naval officer, and my first assignment was in the Persian Gulf, and that is basically something that shaped my whole life. So for students, beware of your first assignment. It can really have an effect on the rest of your life, and so you want to be sure you know what you're getting into. But then I came back. I got a PhD at Columbia. Went to Washington. I'd been working on such issues and worked on the Indian Ocean. And then, due to a complicated set of circumstances, some friends of mine over at the White House invited me to come over and fill in at the end of the Ford administration. And I didn't know what I was getting into, or maybe I did know what I was getting into. But in any event, I went sort of reluctantly, actually. And the rest is history. I got there I stayed into the beginning of the Carter administration, and then the Iranian Revolution happened. And so I sort of backed into this whole thing. It wasn't something that I planned out or laid out in great detail, but it was, I think a lot of people who are happy with their lives feel that they have, in fact, benefited from chance. And I regard myself as extremely lucky, maybe even foolishly lucky, of the way things worked out in ways that I never anticipated.
Well, few people have focused on Iran as much as you, so let's hear what you have to say.
Okay, I want to get through a sort of a background approach to the region and to Iran as a sort of laying the groundwork for what I hope will be your questions, and I look forward to those. And obviously I have to cover a lot of territory in a relatively short period of time. So if you hear anything that strikes you as unusual or that you would like to challenge or hear more about it, please feel free to follow up with a question. The bottom line for me is that the Persian Gulf security issues for the United States has always been tied up with Iran. And that's, maybe it's obvious, but it is important that this country, which we sometimes get along with and mostly for the last 40 years have not gotten along with, nevertheless dominates our thinking about the Persian Gulf and what's going on there. Nixon and Kissinger made a famous trip to Iran in 1972 and talking to the Shah. And as a result of that meeting, they made the Shah our major ally and protector. We looked to him to protect American interests in the region. So our relationship with Iran was not only amicable, but in fact, we were the junior partner in many respects. The Shah was the one that was calling many of the shots, and people don't really appreciate that that's the position that we were in. But then the Iranian Revolution in 1979 came along, and I was in the White House when that happened, and totally demolished the security structure that we had built up around the Shah. Then the hostage crisis, the taking of American hostages and holding them for 444 days, that set the tone for U.S. relations and U.S.-Iran relations that really has persisted ever since. The hostage crisis, in effect, determined the fact that we were sort of permanent enemies. And permanent enemies in a way that even if you look at a country like Vietnam, where the United States lost over 50,000 people in that war, as opposed to Iran, where we lost virtually nobody, we've made peace with Southeast Asia, and we have not made peace with Iran, and we're not even very close to it. So something happened, and it was the hostage crisis, I think, that really set our policies off in a particular direction. The nuclear deal, the so-called JCPOA that Obama negotiated, actually was intended to simply remove proliferation from the subject matter. That basically the idea that Iran would get a nuclear weapon, Obama really wanted to take that off the table. And that is the purpose also of the negotiations that are going on presently. And it offered the opportunity, finally, for a different relationship. Not necessarily a friendly relationship, but a business-like relationship. But then President Trump, as you know, withdrew from the JCPOA, imposed a policy of maximum pressure against Iran, and that possibility of opening up to Iran was eliminated. The current negotiations hold out some opportunity of change, but we don't really know how that's going to work yet, and we can talk about it more later. There are a couple of important things that you may not know about U.S.-Iran relations. First of all, every president since Jimmy Carter has tried to incorporate Iran in some way. Basically, Iran is the missing piece of American strategy in the region. And with Reagan, you had the Iran-Contra affair, where the United States chose to actually secretly sell arms to Iran at a time when they were at war with the Iraqis, and we were actually supporting the other side. It was badly managed. It was a huge scandal, but the reality was that Mr. Reagan regarded this as a strategic opening to Iran. That's the way he identified it. And then Bush, his successor, George Bush, came along and in his first inaugural address announced that with regard to Iran, goodwill begets goodwill. He was also trying to deal with a hostage crisis. There were some American hostages in Lebanon, and basically Bush was offering the idea that if Iran cooperated with us, we'll cooperate with them. He didn't get a second term, which probably cut short any possibility of goodwill that he may have had. President Clinton came in absolutely opposed to Iran and imposed a containment policy that still exists. But at the end of his second term, Iran was actually taking a turn for the better. And we had the Khatami administration came in, President Khatami in Iran, which was more friendly toward the United States. And there was a possibility of normalization. But again, Clinton's time ran out before he could do anything about it. And it never came to pass. Finally, or not finally, but then the second George Bush, George W., basically cooperated with Iran very closely in Afghanistan after 9/11, but then turned around and denounced Iran in his famous Axis of Evil speech. So he basically tried to have it both ways. He was cooperating with Iran, but then basically turned around and denounced them. Obama, as I mentioned, tried to get the JCPOA, or did negotiate the JCPOA, and came the closest to actually changing our relations with Iran. And then Trump imposed maximum pressure and tried to basically overthrow the government of Iran. So all of these presidents, although we were opposed to Iran, were involved with Iran. And the second point that I wanted to make that you may not have thought about is that our US relations with Iran may be the best example of domestic policy as foreign policy. When you think of, we all know, people have realized for years that in order to have foreign policy, it in many cases just reflects our domestic policy, what's going on with domestic politics. You couldn't find a more a clear-cut case of that than with Iran. And that has been true absolutely from Jimmy Carter's day right straight through to the present. It has been very deeply involved with American domestic politics. Let me just specify a few things that have been really important in terms of the US relations with Iran. The first and obvious one, that a place you need to start, is sanctions. Sanctions, especially recently, were designed to actually deprive Iran of virtually all of its commerce. Clearly oil, but also medicines. Even though we said medicines were approved to go through, in fact, the way we set up the sanctions, the way the United States set up the sanctions, by basically freezing the international financial system, that Iran simply you couldn't deal with Iran using the international financial system. And the United States used that as a weapon to basically affect Iran, but also to affect our allies. Most of the actual sanctions that have been put in place to really deal with Iran in the last, say, 5 years have not been against Iran itself. We've sanctioned everything we can sanction in Iran. They were against our allies, basically. The French, Germans, Russians, the British. the Chinese, anybody who might deal with Iran was going to have to pay a fine to the United States for that. And in effect, we created a situation using the sanctions, which was like a medieval siege. Basically, Iran was surrounded, nothing would go in, nothing would go out. Iran responded to this by, among other things, attacking Saudi and Israeli ships. They shot down a US drone. They have done what they could do, in many cases covertly, to overcome the effects. There, in addition to sanctions, we have had assassinations. Not the 6 Iranian nuclear physicists were assassinated on the streets of Tehran or in Iran over the past few years. And in addition to that, the United States, as you know, assassinated Qasem Soleimani, who was Iran's top military leader. This is an act of war, and assassinations, especially killing people who may be indirectly associated with a program, a military program, but that are not military themselves, is an act of war. The United States did not participate in the 6 nuclear physicists. We did participate in the killing of Soleimani. And as you probably know, Iran responded to this, among other things, by firing missiles at Americans who were housed on an Iraqi base. And they did, a number of those people actually suffered traumas that put them out of action for a while. In addition, there's been a remarkable amount of sabotage against Iran. The nuclear centrifuge plant that Iran was running, we helped Israel introduce a malware called Stuxnet, which actually caused a lot of these centrifuges to fail or even to explode. And in addition to that, there have been explosions at several other sites, including in fairly recent days. Iran responded to this, among other ways, by missile and drone attacks against Saudi Arabian oil facilities. And many of you will have seen those pictures of the oil tanks in Saudi Arabia with puncture holes in each one of them. Finally, the United States and its allies have used destabilization. And here we don't hear about this very much in the media, but in reality, using especially the Saudis and others, there has been serious attempts to stir up civil war in Iran, especially in the Arab south of Iran. So in all of these cases, Iran tried to respond to these by killing opposition leaders in Europe. This is not just war by another name. It really is war. And, you know, we don't say that we're at war with Iran. Some people would call it a gray zone between the two. But the reality is that what we've been doing to Iran, eliminating its income, killing high-level individuals, trying to stir up a civil war, sabotaging plants that are operating in Iran. Any country would regard that as lack of war, and that's where we are. All of this has had a huge impact on Iran, needless to say. Iran suffered negative GDP growth for a number of years. Inflation wiped out a lot of the middle class. The job creation in Iran basically stalled. The economy really came to a grinding halt. They handled the coronavirus very badly. They're not the only ones who did, but part of their lack of effectiveness with the coronavirus was due to their lack of access to international financial markets and to the kinds of relief that might have been available to other countries. So Iran was hurt badly, but the question that you have to ask is, did it solve the problem? we, for 40 years, have been putting pressure on Iran. That pressure has been increasing. And although there are negotiations going on now to try to relieve some of the sanctions, the reality is that the Biden administration at this moment has exactly the same sanctions in place, the same policies in place that the Trump administration did. That may change if there's an agreement, but it hasn't changed yet. But despite all of that, Iran really didn't collapse. In fact, in some ways, it may have become stronger. It certainly is more diversified. Iran today is much more self-reliant in terms of its own production of military equipment and other such things than any of the other countries in the Persian Gulf. The other countries in the Gulf buy their weapons from other people, many of them from us. Iran has no access to that market and doesn't even have much access to Chinese and Russian equipment. So they build their own submarines, they build their own mortars, they build their own small arms, and they have actually become stronger in many respects than they were at the beginning of this. The other thing that has happened because of the sanctions and the pressure that the United States and others have brought on Iran is that the hardliners in Iran, and especially the Revolutionary Guard, have really benefited directly. First of all, they welcome the showdown with the United States. That's where they feel most comfortable. And not only that, but of course, they manage the smuggling routes. And so they are the ones who actually benefit financially from the smuggling that has to go on to get by the sanctions. Iran, we have provided incentives for Iran to go back to speeding up its nuclear program. The more we have, in fact, put pressure on Iran since we pulled back from the JCPOA, the more Iran has increased its nuclear activity, not decreased. So Iran today is far closer to actually having the wherewithal to make a nuclear weapon than it has ever been in its entire history. And certainly far, far closer than it was in 2016 and in 2018 when the United States withdrew from the JCPOA. Furthermore, the US use of sanctions very casually, I mean, we basically disrupted the whole international financial system to put the US sanctions on Iran, basically to make US policy world policy. And we did it basically by, I would say, abusing the financial system that we're responsible for maintaining in the world. And that Iran has suffered from that, but other people have started looking for ways to go around it. So basically our stewardship of the international financial system has taken a really reputational hit, and people are trying to find ways to get around it. And that includes China, Russia, and other countries. Not only that, but I don't need to tell you that Iran has really become a world champion smuggler. They are selling oil. We reduced their oil sales by about 2/3. They're back to about 2/3 of their peak performance, all at a time when the sanctions remain in place. It's a tricky process, but they've become very good at it. And they also make good use of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in order to do their smuggling work. There are two countries today in the Middle East that really dominate the region. One of them is Iran, and the other is Israel. It's curious in the sense that these two countries, whose rivalry creates dissidence and basically drives the direction of policy in the region, it is completely left out the Arabs. When we think about the Middle East, we think about Arabs. I mean, that is the natural logic that you make in your mind. In reality, the Arabs have become far less important in the Middle East over the last generation than it was before. And I think you have to keep that in mind in thinking about the changes that have taken place and where the region may go from here. The landscape of oil, of course, has changed. The world doesn't need as much oil, or is beginning to need less oil than it needed in the past. There is basically an oil glut. We have more oil than we needed. Instead of running out of oil, we've actually got more oil than we need. Part of the results of that is that the United States is losing interest in the region. The United States was in the Persian Gulf for many reasons, but no matter where you begin, the first reason was always oil, the free flow of oil in the region. It's hard to find an argument that the free flow of oil is any danger right now. Everybody wants to sell their oil, including the Iranians. And if the Iranians get back into the game, the oil markets are very nervous right now that the price of oil will drop substantially. So Obama tried to take, let's just look very briefly at, in closing here, at three recent US strategies. So Obama, as I said, tried to take nuclear stuff off the table and begin the process of Iranian re-entry into the world community, encouraging the regional states to work out their own arrangements with Iran as the US gradually winds down. Trump came along and did what appeared to be exactly the reverse, basically imposing maximum pressure on Iran, creating an anti-Iran coalition of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE to oppose Iran at every stage while the United States winds down. I think that was behind, that was the purpose behind the actions that Trump took. Now Biden is attempting to return to the JCPOA, but beyond that, it's unclear, beyond his expressed determination to end forever wars, exactly where we're going to go. I fully expect that the US footprint is going to shrink under Biden, or for that matter, any other president. I think that is baked into the equation, and it's going to happen. But it can be done in a variety of ways with a variety of different outcomes. Beyond that prediction, if you like, my crystal ball is very, very cloudy. Like everybody else who works in the Middle East, my record of production is extremely spotty, and we all fail actually to see what's going on. But I do want to at least point out to you that there's a lot I haven't talked about here. I haven't talked about Yemen, what's going on there. I haven't talked about the history between Iran and the Gulf Cooperation Councils, the influence of Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, Iranian domestic policy, Iranian regional strategy, and so forth. But I'm sure that a lot of bright people out there are going to have questions to ask, and please feel free to address those issues as well as the ones that I've put on the table. In any case, it was a pleasure, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Gary. And indeed, I have some of those questions to probe, and I want to again encourage everyone to submit their questions in our Q&A box, and we'll work them into the conversation. One thing, Gary, that you did not really talk about, and that was one of the key criticisms of the JCPOA, is Iran's support of terrorist activity and proxies. And certainly Hezbollah has always been an issue. And then most recently, in the last 7 to 10 days, what we've been seeing in Gaza and Israel, the support of Hamas. Could you expand on that, and particularly Iran's selling or giving of weapons, the missiles, to Hamas?
Actually, there's one factor in that that I would like to stress, because there are a number of people today who are trying to make the argument that somehow we have to maintain our present sanctions against Iran, because if we lift those sanctions, the maximum pressure campaign against Iran, they will pour that money into Hamas and Hezbollah and the like. I would just remind everybody that Iran is, at the present time, has been under the most severe sanctions of any country in the world for at least 3 years and probably 10 years. So if there's a relationship between Iran's support for Hamas or Hezbollah and the amount of money that Iran has to spend, why is Hamas acting now when Iran is potentially the most stressed that it has perhaps ever been as far as the sanctions are concerned? I think people make too much of the linkage. Hamas would be there doing what it's doing whether Iran existed or not, and so would Hezbollah. They are both beneficiaries without question of Iran's support. They, the countries in the region, allies of Iran, Assad in Syria, buy oil from Iran, and they benefit. They get it at a good price. In fact, anybody can buy Iranian oil at a good price these days. They're discounting it very much, trying to break through the smuggling, the barrier. But Iran's strategy is to, in fact, maintain a forward defense. Basically, they don't have much of any military that can actually project power outside the borders of Iran. So they look for other ways of projecting power and basically to protect themselves. And that's their bargain, basically, with Hezbollah and Hamas and others.
Well, when you say protect themselves,
but these are things that we don't like, and we don't agree with their policy. But the reality is, they have been supporting these states, these non-state actors, and they will continue to do so. And basically, it doesn't take very much money, but they are in fact supplying weapons they have supplied weapons to Hamas and to Hezbollah. And this is, so here they are, a country that is under maximum sanctions that you can imagine. They have just had a big breakthrough in getting weapons through to Hamas, and Hamas has fired, 135,000 rockets or something at the time, even though Hamas is living in a really very closed area of Gaza. So one, I would just argue, because the argument is being made very widely, that if you want to stop Iran's relationship with Hamas and Hezbollah and other non-state actors in the region, you would do better to find a way to solve some of the political problems there, rather than trying to say you'll keep Iran from, you'll starve them of funds to such a degree that they will stop supporting these countries.
Gary, what is their end game? Is it to destabilize the Arab countries by doing that?
Well, I mean, the end game is basically Iran's strategy. Iran, as I said, has no military that is capable of projecting power outside its own borders. They are not a threat to their neighbors in the sense of military forces marching across the border and taking over Iraq, for instance. That's not going to happen. But they have enemies. And I think it's very clear that they have enemies. If you look at the sabotage and assassinations and the siege of Iran over the past few years, they need a way to break out of that. Just as Israel needed a way to break out of the circle of hostile Arab states many years ago. Iran looks to their friends in the region to support them and to act as sort of forward defense lines that they depend on. And because they depend on them for a strategic reason, not because they like these people, not because they're trying to interfere in the politics of the region. They're looking to these supporters in the region to basically provide a layer of defense.
But it certainly makes it hard for the U.S. and to have stable, improved relations with Iran when this is taking place. I want to ask you about the upcoming presidential elections, which take place are scheduled to take place in mid-June on the 18th. And one of the things that I've never quite understood was what the Guardian Council is, and how it operates. And just to remind our viewers, this is the group of about 6 people or so who
12.
decide, 12 people, who decide who may run in the presidential elections. How does it operate?
Okay, well, the Guardian Council was created for a very different reason. It was created basically to oversee the other parts of the government which were more secular. This is religious. So this is the kind of a series of very senior clerics who basically have the right to examine and challenge laws, developments that are they would regard as unreligious, as non-Shia. And so they have an oversight view everywhere. This doesn't exist in really any other country or almost any other country. In fact, in one respect, Iran as a sort of theocratic state is almost unique. The only other case I can think of is the Vatican, actually, where you have actually similar groups of senior clerics that oversee perfectly secular activities of the postal service and other things in the Vatican. In a way, it's helpful to think of Iran in those terms. But they have been given the job now by the supreme leader, basically to vet any applicants to run for office in Iran, for the parliament and also for the presidency. The Iranian constitution basically didn't provide for any primary elections. So anybody basically in Iran can apply to run for president. They have had as many as several hundred, even thousands of people applying, people off the street just walking in and applying to run for president. So they didn't have a way of, deciding who was qualified in that group. So that job was given to the Guardian Council, and the Council of Guardians basically misuses that power and decides basically who is good for Iran from their perspective. And they basically, for instance, they have thrown out people who have actually been president in the past. President Rafsanjani was turned down for one run. Ahmadinejad, who is trying to run again, was turned down. And Khatami, all of these people had actually been the president of Iran. They had been elected. They were supporters of the theocratic system, but they were rejected by the Guardian Council. So it's a misuse of their power, and everybody waits to see what will happen. Usually they only leave about 3 or 4 people who are running.
Basically it is a smoke-filled room on steroids.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about somebody who was perhaps going to run, and that is the foreign minister, Javad Zarif. Will he run? Would he be, would the Guardian Council not let him run? And what is your read about the leaked tapes that came out a few weeks ago, where he was quite critical of the military and somewhat critical of the supreme leader?
The Zarif is not going to run. He has said he's not going to, and I believe him. And a very good friend of mine who is very closely plugged into the power structure in Tehran was promoting Zarif as the best possible candidate on the sort of the reform side of the ticket. Zarif was never speaking for Zarif, and Zarif always said he was not going to run. And it's now, after these tapes have appeared, basically what Zarif did was he did 8 hours of oral history for an academic who was actually doing a long-term project. Those tapes were, of course, supposed to wait until Zarif was dead, or until many, many years later before they would get released. they got leaked, of course, immediately. And what happened, what he actually said was that the Revolutionary Guard and the hardliners interfere with Iran's foreign policy, and that in many cases, they're more effective than he is in getting the policies done. Everybody knows that's true. Mm-hmm. Nobody is supposed to say it. And so by the fact that he said it, he sort of let the cat out of the bag, and people are having a very serious discussion. But these are facts that basically anybody who thinks about Iran very, very much knows that what he's saying there is simply a fact of life.
Gary, when you look in your crystal ball, who do you think may be the next president of Iran?
We have been surprised almost always by who is ultimately chosen in Iran. I was in a meeting with a series of very knowledgeable Iran watchers just before the Ahmadinejad election, and his name did not even come up for discussion. Nobody expected that he was going to come through.
Well, as we know in our own country, we can have surprises too.
There are surprises, and
let me bring
so
in
I expect surprises.
Let me bring in a question from Kenneth Apt. Short of another revolution, do you see any possibility of movements via constitution or other political elements that move Iran towards a more secular status?
I happen to be among those who believe that if Iran is a very commercial society. I mean, it's an entrepreneurial society. They start businesses. Their export business has been doing extremely well. They make their own cars. From stuff that they buy from Europe, of course, and other things. But it's a very entrepreneurial society. I think if Iran were permitted to participate openly in the international community, like any other country, that over time, the current system would not be able to prevail. And I think that is precisely why the hardliners are so upset when a reformer basically appears, or when Iran actually negotiates with the United States. They don't want it to work. They fear that. And the reason they fear it is that Iran could gradually turn into something that it is not presently. And that would mean that the hardliners' power would be reduced. I can't give you a better answer than that. At the moment, the hardliners are dominant. They completely dominate the parliament. They completely dominate the supreme leaders section, and very likely there's going to be a hardliner president.
There's an article that you and I discussed earlier that appeared in Responsible Statecraft, a part of the Quincy Institute, and I encourage our audience to subscribe and look into the Quincy Institute. But the title of this article by Sina Tusi is How U.S. and Iranian Hardliners Work Towards Shared Goal of Killing the Nuclear Deal. Clearly, if the JCPOA or the new JCPOA, if such thing would exist, went before Congress, I think you'd agree with me that its chance of passage would be quite remote. What are the goals of U.S. hardliners?
I don't agree if the implication is that the JCPOA could not get through Congress. I think there's I wouldn't say remote. I would say it's so close to 50-50 that it's like so many other things that are going on right now in the Congress. But I do think that it would be difficult for it to be thrown out entirely. But anyway, whatever but beyond that, what is your question?
Well, who leads the hardliners in the United States?
Oh, it's a very diverse group, starting, of course, with President Trump and the people around him. They were as anti-Iran as any group I have ever encountered. There are a number of foreign policy groups, think tanks in the United States that are fully dedicated. That's their principal objective, is to basically prevent any relationship between the United States and Iran.
Name them. Name one or two of those. Which ones?
Well, I mean, just look at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. It's baked into their DNA. That's what they do.
What about the Iranian diaspora?
They are like Iranians everywhere, that you ask 3 Iranians for an opinion and you get 4 opinions. They are divided among themselves. Part of the Iranian diaspora would like very much to establish some kind of relationships. They would like to be able to go back home for visits. Many of them actually do, but it's become very, very difficult to do that. They would like to do that, and that's becoming far more, that's becoming very difficult. There are others who, particularly who were strong supporters of the Shah, who basically were on his side during the revolution. They've taken up residence in California and various other places, and they're very, very strong, and they're very strong supporters of President Trump and the anti-Iranian group. So there are lots of different opinions and all versions in between as far as the Iranian diaspora is concerned.
Let me bring in a comment, and I'm sorry I don't have his or her name, just have a number. But this person, my husband and I were in Iran with John Woods about 10 years ago and found the Iranians we spoke with to be very pro-American. They fell in love with the country. So I want to ask you, given the sanctions that are so burdensome, what is the general perception of the United States now among in the Iran street? And then to go back to this question, what books might you recommend on Iran? But we'll come to that in just a second.
Well, it's a very, to me, it's a very sad case, because I used to have people ask me, what do you think? Should I make a trip to Iran? Should I go as a visitor? And I would almost always say yes. Right now, my answer is no. I think this is not a good time. I think you should not go to Iran unless you really know what you're doing. And even if you do know what you're doing, you're taking a great risk, simply because this war has been going on for some time, and you have the war going on inside Iran. The reality is that according to all of the polls that are taken, and in fact, there are some very good polls that are done that use basically telephone to reach Iran. Iranian speakers speaking to Iranians, not using names, double blind type operations. The reality is that Iranians who used to be very pro-American are not now. And that's something that I deeply regret, because that was one sort of ace that we had in the hole. The fact that the Iranian population were basically pro-Western. They wanted to have relations with the West, and that appreciation of the West has declined dramatically over the past 10 years.
And to go back to this question, what books would you recommend on current Iranian politics? And what do you read and follow to keep up on what's occurring in Iran?
Well, doing a bibliography right here, basically what I read, and there are lots of good books. I mean, really lots of good books on Iran and Iran policy. And the main thing to look at when you're looking at books, quite a few of them are sitting here behind me on my shelf, is what you want to know is who wrote it. And so I recommend, if you're interested in a book, first of all, there are books about sort of tourism and what, and the culture of Iran. As you know, Iran has a very old culture. It has a love of poetry that is extraordinary, has its own cuisine. It's a remarkable place from that point of view, and you can write books about that. There are other books, of course, about sort of the inner workings of what's going on right at this moment in the politics of the thing. And there, as I say, really look, for instance, Vali Nasser is a good friend of mine and an associate who has written a new book and has written actually several books about Iran, both about the religious nature of the government and also of the sort of the current.
And on
politics.
a day-to-day basis, what website would you go to or newspaper?
I basically, I do think that the Quincy Institute and its online publication called Responsible Statecraft would be as good a place, would be a very good place. But the one single source, if you want to start just at the beginning and get a good bibliography and almost anything you want to know about Iran and about the subject that is really up to date, is there's a website called the Iran Primer, Primer. And if you simply put Iran Primer into your browser, it will find that for you. And that is like an encyclopedia of Iran, which is written for ordinary people. It's not written for just experts, but it covers an enormous variety of different subjects, including the past, the hostage crisis and the like, but a lot of things that are going on currently. You'll find there articles up to date as of yesterday.
That's regarding. Nice. I want to encourage everyone to do that, and maybe we can pop up the URL for that. And full disclosure to my new friends in Santa Fe, I'm a graduate of the University of Virginia. In fact, went there because I wanted to study with a man named Ruhollah Ramazani. And he was really the dean of US-Iran relations. The books are dated because they were written in the 80s and 90s, but it'll give you a very good insight. I think Gary would agree with me on that.
Totally. He was a very, very good friend and was really an old world scholar in the sense of being deeply immersed in Iran's history, background, but also very much aware of what was going on at the time. And his books are slightly dated today, but if you want a sense of how Iran's history plays into its politics today, Ramazani is as good a place as you could find to start. And
you can find his articles in Foreign Affairs as well. And one of the reasons I brought that up, not just mention my tie to the University of Virginia, but to bring in Diana Baker's question. And she talks about the issue of the overthrow of the Prime Minister Mossadegh. I believe that was 1953. 53. How much of an impact does that still have?
This is a huge topic in itself, and it's a very good example of the fact that history is very much a live thing. The history of the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953, which was done by the U.S. CIA together with the British MI6. That I hope my New York noise in the background is not drowning me out entirely. But in any case, that overthrow and the way it happened is still vigorously debated among scholars as of this day. And the reason that it's so debated is because of the effects that it has. Basically, some people would argue, as Stephen Kinzer does in his book, All the President's Men, that the overthrow of Mossadegh was in fact, could be traced directly to the overthrow of the Shah, that basically it laid the groundwork for what became the Iranian Revolution. It's a live subject. There's a wonderful a documentary out by Taghi Amirabadi. I'm sorry. I got the name rather jumbled, which I think is just called The Coup. I recommend it to anybody who is interested in the subject. But the reality is that this event of the overthrow of an elected prime minister in Iran and the return of the Shah to the throne basically set a course for politics and policies in Iran and the involvement of the United States, that has never ceased to this day. And I personally look at it, and my catchphrase is that this moment was when the United States lost its political virginity with regard to Iran. We had always been the good guys up until that point, and we were regarded as not one of those bad guys who was constantly trying to interfere with Iranian politics, the Russians, the British, and the like. The 53 episode changed that completely, and we have since been seen by Iranians as just another power that was trying to involve itself in their internal affairs.
And that's a good segue to a piece I picked up yesterday from the Chicago Council. And I typed in polls, Iranian perceptions of Americans, and this is what popped up. And Chicago Council, working with an Iranian polling agency, reported this a few days ago. Even if the United States does return to the Iran agreement, a majority in Iran think it is unlikely the United States will live up to its obligations under the agreement. 60% versus 37% who thinks it's likely. So Gary, my question is this. We had an administration, President Obama and John Kerry, the JCPOA was implemented. Then we had a very quick withdrawal with President Trump. I suspect there will be a JCPOA 2.0, but we don't know what's going to happen in 2024. How do we in the United States, and how do our allies in other countries, how can they react and handle this potential whipsaw in US foreign policy, which heretofore had not been as much the case?
It's an extraordinarily important question, and I think the answer is, if you were an Iranian and you were looking at what has happened in the last 5 years, what would you think? Would you think that these Americans are people that can be trusted? What if you were a Brit or a Frenchman or a German, and looking at their participation in the JCPOA, which they signed with us? We negotiated it. They signed it with us. They have continued to maintain their position in favor of it, and the United States turned its back and walked away from it. Even the good things. I mean, whatever one thinks of the JCPOA, and I know that there are very deep differences of opinion, the reality is it was intended to do one thing, or maybe two things. The first thing was to get the nuclear proliferation issue off the table. Just put that aside so that the idea of Iran's imminent nuclear weapon was no longer a fact, and that can still be done. The second thing was that it was a way to begin to actually deal with Iran in a more straightforward fashion than we had before. And that, unfortunately, was lost. And whether it can be regained or not, I don't really know. That was basically the way it was going to change our relationship with Iran, is that we would behave differently and Iran would behave differently. And Iran actually agreed with us, and they were doing their part as far as the JCPOA was concerned. And then we backed away. This is a history, not just of the United States, but of Iran also. We don't trust each other. And I think, especially after the past few years, we trust each other even less than we did before. And I think that is really unfortunate, because you're not going to be able to have a comprehensive, coherent policy for the United States in the Persian Gulf without dealing with Iran. It's not a blank space on the map. It occupies territory, and it becomes important to all of us. So that's really the reason that I think we're talking about it here today.
So this is a good opportunity to bring Barbara Chatterjee. And Barbara, if I've mispronounced your last name, I apologize, but you have such a good question. She says, how long can the United States maintain the Trumpian economic grip on our allies? And those are, indeed the other participants in the JCPOA. And what kind of workarounds did our allies take so that they could get around these economic sanctions?
Well, let me just start with a very quick story. I have a friend, or someone that I became quite well acquainted with, who in fact was a Swiss diplomat. But before he was a diplomat, he was a banker. And one of the reasons that he became a diplomat is that his bank was subjected to enormous fines by the United States because they had done what seemed to be perfectly legal things with Iran. And he basically lost his job and the bank went bankrupt. Now that's what we've been doing to our friends around the world for the last actually 10 years or more, ever since we learned to weaponize the financial system, that basically anybody who uses that system to deal with Iran is a criminal, basically, today. And the other countries are looking for ways to get around this. When I asked my friend, well, you know, isn't somebody else isn't going to find another way to deal with the international financial system that won't be the United States? He said, well, for the moment, there isn't anybody. He said, would you trust the Chinese to take over? Would you trust the Russians? The Brits are in the middle of the Brexit business. The EU isn't really equipped for this. Who's going to do it? But the reality is that separate markets are now beginning to emerge for the sale of oil, for the transfer of money from one place to another, that do not touch the American dominated system. So my feeling is, not today or tomorrow, but in the long run, we have paid an enormous price for this. We have basically undercut not only our trustworthiness as an ally, but we've undercut our trustworthiness as a steward of the international financial system. And that is going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to restore. And I really regret that.
So looking for other options that Iran has, I'm holding an article that was in the New York Times at the end of March. And the headline of it is, China, with $400 billion Iran deal, could deepen influence in the Middle East. So is the Belt and Road Initiative, which we hear so much about, is China effectively using that?
China is developing a commercial network in that part of the world that is the most ambitious, basically, that anybody has seen ever since, say, the Marshall Plan in Europe after World War II. It's highly ambitious. At the moment, it is primarily commercial. They loan money, they cooperate in projects, they build bridges, they build roads, they put in communication systems, they do economic partnerships and so forth. And that's basically what it is today. Will it become something more than that? Almost certainly. I mean, clearly the Chinese are using this as a way of expanding their influence, not in a heavy-handed way. They're not bringing in soldiers with the Belt and Road Initiative, but I don't have a hard time believing that the soldiers are not that far behind. That just as we always found, as we became deeply involved with other parts of the world, we wanted to have some protection available for our interests in the region. And I think the Chinese are probably going to do the same. I think the deal that was done between Iran and China should be seen as a bellwether, not as an answer. Basically, it's not such a big deal. It's not even, the 400 billion is kind of an imaginary number. That's just something that somebody has tagged onto.
But it's certainly symbolic.
It's huge. It's huge.
Gary, we only have another minute or two, and I realized I did not ask you about MBS. So The Economist just recently had a story about MBS and said, you know, is he newly minted? Are we seeing a very different MBS? And is that because the United States has sort of decreased its emphasis, its footprint? Take another, if I may ask you to do this in under a minute, what is behind these secret negotiations, secret discussions between Saudi Arabia and Iran?
Actually, I look at this as really a very positive sign. I think it's significant that it's Iraq that is acting as a go-between here, and that's not something that they have done in the past. I also think it's significant that it was in Iraq that we killed Soleimani, and it was on their soil. And according to the Iranians, when Soleimani was killed, he was coming from the Levant, from Lebanon, basically bearing a message for the Saudis, for that there were secret negotiations going on. And whether or not that was true, the reality is there are negotiations going on. I think at this point, it's probably mostly that the Saudis have discovered that they can't rely on us for sure, that they really do believe that we're going to gradually withdraw from the region. They need to spend more time thinking about their own policies and getting their own house in order. Personally, I think that's a very good thing. And if there's more of that in the region of the countries, the UAE started talking to the Iranians very shortly.
Positive. And Gary, I hate to do it, but I think we got to bring Sandy into the conversation. Really enjoyed being with you. Sandy, over to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Jim. Thanks very much. And what a great conversation. A lot to learn and a lot to think about in this really complex dynamic. So Gary Sick, let me thank you so much for taking the time and joining us today. Thanks very much.
It was a real pleasure being with you. And obviously we need several weeks to sort out all of these issues.
Maybe more.
Maybe more.
And Jim Falk, thank you so much. That was just a great conversation. Many thanks. And to all of you out there, let us see you next week on Thursday at 10 a.m. Where we will get into Iran issues again, where we really look at the foreign policy of Israel towards Iran, the amazing story of what Israel has done to frustrate Iran's nuclear ambitions. We'll look at Iranian foreign policy to Israel, which of course includes support for Hamas. Lots of issues, on we go. Until then, I hope you all have a great day, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.